What's going on, guys? It's Justin here from Summit Racing, and we have a very special guest in the studio. We have Robby Layton from Robby Layton Nation, and he showed up with this sweet 57 Chevy project that we're going to be doing a lot of fun stuff to. At the end of the week, this thing is going to run and drive right out of the Summit studio and back to Utah. But we wanted to take a minute and show you guys some of the things we didn't really pay attention to when you bought this car. So we have a little guide today to teach you guys about classic cars, and so you don't bite off more than you can chew. But thankfully, Summit Racing has parts for all your classic needs. So Robby, let's get into this thing, go over it, and kind of see some of the things you should look for when you're buying a project car.
Yeah, basically, we're gonna show you what is good and what is not good. Had I not flown across the country after purchasing this car, I wouldn't have bought it. So there's some things that you may not think about that you need to look for when you go to buy a car that I didn't even consider before flying across the country and buying it. So we're gonna go over the body end of it. Justin's gonna take care of the mechanical side of it and show you guys so you don't make the same mistakes that we may have made in the past.
Tell us what you see, feel, and what we should look for.
So for a 1957 Chevy Belair, this doesn't look terrible at first sight. Take a look around it. The car is fairly straight. You see some rusting on the top surfaces, which is pretty normal for an unrestored car. At first glance, this car looks great, but you start walking around it, you start seeing a few more issues that you may not notice in photos. So over here, I can show you, you're gonna see a little bit of rust falling here. So look at that. We've got peeling paint, flaking paint everywhere. That's gonna be your first sign that something has been done to this car. Factory paint jobs are not that thick, but it's not a huge deal. Paint can be stripped off. This, though, you're not gonna see in a picture. So the bottom side of this fender is actually unattached from the outside rocker panel. And unless you get down and you actually feel and take a look around, you're not gonna see that in any form of pictures, videos, unless somebody's actually showing you. But if you're going to buy a car, they're usually not gonna show you these types of issues. Moving on to the back side, again, pretty decent looking car. Top side looks good. Everything that I'm seeing visually right here doesn't concern me, because anybody that's in the restoration industry, they understand that it's a restoration. So you're going to be taking off all the old, fixing it, and rebuilding it from the ground up.
That is like, especially, you know, with a car like this, what this thing is, so 56, this thing is what, almost 70 years old at this point?
70 years old.
So you have to think someone has probably had their hands on it at some point, and we obviously can tell that.
Yes.
But that's a big thing, and you know, if you're gonna do paint, you know, add metal, paint it, that you need good bones to start with, and you can't paint rust, and you can't attach metal to rust. So
if you're rebuilding a house, you're gonna be fixing your foundation before you can put a solid structure on top of that foundation. So this is our structure. We need to see what the foundation is. So after we look around the outside, we're actually gonna put this thing on the lift, raise it up, and show you guys the underside. So these are a few things that you may not see because you won't have a lift where you're looking at a vehicle. So I'm gonna show you some tricks on how you can actually examine something without being underneath it. Now, one thing you can do is go right here and stick your hand behind the rocker panel. Now on this, just by one little grab, all this rust is falling out. I can actually feel through the body mount, I can feel through the inner rocker, and I can tell that this car has a significant amount of rust. If you're not an expert and you don't have access to the resources needed to fix a car like this, at this point I would turn away and not buy the car. If you stick your hand in there and it is solid, okay, let's keep looking. But once we get it on the lift, we'll show you exactly what I was doing right there and show you guys how bad and how extensive this rust actually is. Now, Justin was talking about the fact that this car has been restored at some point in its life. I'm gonna show you how we figured that out. So I'm gonna hide it real quick. Just act like you don't see this. So over here we had a lot of Bondo. Now, Bondo is a brand, it's actually called plastic filler. There's nothing wrong with plastic filler, but this has been lifted off of the metal. So you can see we flaked it off, chipped it, came over to here, and you can actually see that at some point in this car's life, somebody has done an old school repair where they've riveted a patch panel on, they've brazed it, they've leaded it. I mean, there's a few different styles of repair here. So this is gonna have to be addressed for sure. Now this, it's not a huge deal, but you know that you've got to cut this out and re-weld a new solid patch panel in, because you're not going to work over top of rivets and an old style repair like that. So anyway, these are just a few things that you want to look for on the top side. If you have access to a lift, this is where we're going to show you everything underneath and the worst part of this vehicle.
We got this thing in the air, and I'm just going to touch on some of the things you need to look for in a drivetrain. So pulling this thing in the studio, we put it on our Go Jacks to roll it inside because all the brakes were locked up on this thing. And that's kind of a thing to think about. You know, when these cars sit for a long time and you're gonna buy a car and restore it, you need every soft rubber line, tires, brake lines, small brake parts. So if all that stuff is locked up and seized, it's just a good thing to think about that you need to go through it. After, especially with like brake and fuel lines, with old fuels and brake fluid, it breaks down the rubber products. So it's a good idea when looking at a car, if it's a barn fresh car like this, just to plan on replacing all that stuff. And just kind of looking, all our rubber bushings and everything underneath this car are in pretty bad shape. Now inspecting the engine can be a whole nother thing. There's a big difference between buying a running, driving car or a field or barn fresh car. This car, we threw a breaker bar on the balancer and the motor's locked up. So you could take some time, maybe pour some things down the cylinders like a WD-40 or something of that nature and try to get this thing broke up and loose. A lot of guys love to use ATF for that purpose. If you can get the engine free, at least you can spin it over, yank it out, and maybe have a possibility of rebuilding it. And that's a big thing too if you're doing a nut and bolt restoration or something you want in a numbers matching original car. It's good to do a little bit of research ahead of time. So, there's great companies where you can get, actually, if the owner of the car will give you the VIN number, you can pay a little bit of money and get the whole history on this car. And, in the aspect of going numbers matching and a real, high dollar expensive restoration, you're gonna wanna verify the numbers on the block and even some of the RPO codes that are listed in the car's build sheet. Now, with that, what are some of the things you notice underneath this thing, Robby?
So right off, I want to show you guys exactly what I was talking about when I reach my hands under here, because you can, without a lift and without doing too much work, you can actually feel the inside of the rockers. So back here is where I felt all the crusty rust. So you can see that this this floor support is actually rotted off of the inside of the rocker panel. So everything's gonna have to be replaced. You're gonna be replacing the floor structure, the inner rocker, the outer rocker. You're most likely gonna be skinning the quarter panel because you gotta remove that to get into here. Another thing that caught my eye is right here is a patch panel that's at some point in this car's life was riveted on. So this tells me that it was probably done back in the 70s or 80s when this was normal procedure for repairing stuff. So in my opinion, if this was a candidate for a full restoration, I would pass on the purchase. I would find a better, more solid car and start with that. Unless it has something on the build sheet that makes this car super, super valuable, the time and money and effort, you could probably start with a better donor car to do a restoration on than this one. Now, that's not to say that this isn't a perfect project for a street rod or the type of build that we're gonna do, where we're gonna do a, will this be considered like a resto rod?
Yeah, it's something, we call it that,
Basically, what we're gonna do is we're gonna update all the drivetrain, and we're gonna be driving this car across the country. So we wanna make sure that it's 100% drivable. That way, when we get out on the open road, we're not gonna break down. So we're gonna be starting at the back and going all the way to the front, removing all the old stuff. We're doing fuel lines, brake lines, wiring. Everything that's required to get this thing to run and drive will be new here from Summit Racing.
You have to take everything with a grain of salt when it comes into the classic car industry because there's one right way to fix everything and there's 100 wrong ways to fix everything.
These are just key points to look for so that you don't get into something and bite off more than you can chew.
Yeah, and that is a cool, especially like these and super desirable cars, companies like Real Deal Steel, you can buy a whole brand new 57 Chevy body. So, if you had something like this.
So I did notice that the one thing that, by looking at this car, the frame is solid. There's a little bit of minor surface rust, but other than that, the chassis itself is super, super solid. And that's why we've decided to do what we're doing, because everything that connects to the frame is gonna be perfectly fine.
So another thing to pay attention, especially on older cars like this, is the rear end. Now, we're not gonna be reusing this thing. We kind of checked it out. It's got a little bit of noise and it's got at least one locked up brake. So we don't really want to take the time and effort to go through and rebuild this old rear end. But a big thing on some of these older cars is you had to pay attention to make sure there wasn't another rear end swapped in it. Cars like these ended up with Ford 9 inches, big Oldsmobile rear ends. It kind of always depended. And this thing has a factory rear end in it still, so we're gonna go ahead and put something a little cooler in it. One of the things that Robby kind of noticed as well when we were looking at this car is it's had some kind of repair to the front leaf spring mounts. And that's something you're gonna wanna pay attention to on your car as well. Now, moving even farther back, you can kind of look at the gas tank, and if you look at the gas gauge in this thing, it probably reads E because it has a nice little hole in it. The nice thing about these though is parts like this, are extremely easy to find, especially somewhere here like Summit Racing.
So one thing that I noticed is that this thing at one point in its life has been coated with some sort of a tar. Normally, working on cars with tar on the underside, it's a corrosion protection product that usually helps. Back here, it's actually helped us because this fuel tank's gonna have to be changed, and we still have coating on the bolts and on the straps. So we're gonna be able to remove those, put a new gas tank in, and everything will be solid mounted as it should. Right here, we've got one shock mount that's been ripped out, so that's gonna have to either get welded or we're gonna have to build some sort of a bolt-on bracket that's gonna secure the new shock when we replace this rear end. In my opinion, it's got so much rust that it's not gonna be a full nut and bolt restoration. So now we're gonna do fun stuff with it, where we make it look cool, make it super drivable, and just get out and have fun with it.
Now, something we didn't touch on also is the electrical side of this. You know, with cars sitting outside and barns and that, whatever they use to coat these wires, mice, squirrels, any kind of rodent, it tastes sweet to them. So they'll eat a harness out of a car. So if you had a car that's set in a barn, a garage, something like that, even outside, and mice have made their way inside it, that's something you need to think about too, is before putting a battery in the car and, you know, just trying to fire the thing up and possibly starting a fire can be really dangerous, you're gonna wanna take a lot of time to look at the wiring. And one of the cool things about wiring is companies like Painless Performance make entire wiring harnesses for this car. And I'll give you guys kind of a little bit of a, you know, a preview. I highly recommend using one because we're gonna be using one in this deal.
We're gonna be putting a complete 57 Chevy front to back wiring harness in this. I think it's a 28 circuit. So it's gonna have a little bit more space that we can add accessories if we want once we get this back to Utah. But we're gonna be, basically, we want turn signals, brake lights, headlights, and everything that we need to safely drive this car across the country. So that includes windshield wipers. We may not have a radio, we may not have a heater, we may not have any luxurious item on this car other than the safety lights that we're required to have. So, but with that wiring harness, it gives you a lot of capabilities to repair this thing and put it back to how it needs to be.
So we've seen the outside, underneath. I'm gonna take this thing back down and just show you guys the interior. So doing a little bit of research, we just went ahead and looked at the VIN, and we're gonna decode this for you guys. If it's preceded by a V, that means it's a factory V8 equipped car, and then the next letter kind of deciphers the package. So if it was an A, it was a 150, if it's a B, it's a 210, and if it's a C, it's a Belair. So looking at our car, just by our quick surface inspection, this thing is a V8 equipped Belair, and that's what we have sitting in front of us. Now, you know, we have all our factory gauges still in here. And this thing was highly optioned when it was brand new. It's still got a really nice steel dash. It doesn't have a hole rusted in it, so that dash could be fixed. You know, you still have your mirror, but you want to make sure your headliner rods are still there. You know, if you want to do factory seats, your factory seat frames, because tracking some of this stuff down can not only be expensive, but timely. This interior is kind of in rough shape. We have a nice Flintstone hole in the floor, but we're going to patch that up with something, you know, so it's a little more enjoyable for Robby's long drive home. It even has the fun clock in the dash and a little bit more of a modern radio. They even threw some speakers in the back. Now, if you were gonna restore this car, you'd have to find a nice dash panel because this car was not factory radio equipped or had a really small one, and they kind of punched a hole, but we're not gonna worry about that. You know, our radio is a luxury at this point. But yeah, and you know, one of our favorite features, unfortunately, our headlight switch is locked up. But
yes, but part of the Painless wiring harness, it comes with a new switch.
Yeah, so Painless really thinks of it all when they build harnesses for cars like this. Now we've looked in the interior, we're gonna go one last spot, and that's under the hood. So let's head out there. We've popped open the hood and we've kind of looked around, and you know, this old V8 is, she's kind of in not her greatest shape. We tried to spin it over, it's locked up unfortunately, and we really don't want to take the time to mess with it, so we're gonna yank this one out. Now, if we were gonna restore this car and do that, we'd wanna pay attention to stuff like that, to, you know, check the number on the block and see if it's a number matching motor to the car, because that can make or break a high dollar restoration. And just some of the other things to look for is, you know, steering gear. When restoring a car and buying something like this, you have to think that you're gonna replace it all, but you wanna make sure all the hard parts themselves are there. With a car like this, you'd want to update it to modern brakes because it has an old single-piece style master cylinder. Kind of looking, this thing has like probably an original radiator.
Looks like it's brass. It's been repaired at one point in its life, so it's 60 years old.
Yeah, you know, this thing, I'm sure if this car could talk, it could tell us some really cool stories.
Grandma doesn't have her screen anymore because it's right here.
Yes, that is one of the fun things about old cars like this, is cleaning them out and seeing some of the things people did. So
Resourcefulness.
Yes.
Back in the day, people would resource parts. They wouldn't go buy brand new parts. They would just find what they had and they would make it work.
So maybe they drove, this thing lived in an area where it was like either maybe a bunch of grass or something like that. Maybe a ton of bugs always got caught in the radiator, and they were like, oh, I got an old window screen. Let's
that
throw
would
it
fit
in there.
perfect here.
So, and kind of had Robby had touched on before, just until we popped the hood on this car, looking like this is an old, that's a gas weld brazing repair. And that is, that's not the modern way to fix things.
No, but it's holding. I mean, this is the way they did it back in the old school days.
So these are just kind of some of the things to pay attention. We could get into the nitty gritty of this car, bust fenders off it, do that kind of and see the true damage, but we're not getting that far into it. We're gonna have a little more fun with it.
We're actually gonna make it run and drive, and we're gonna drive it 1,859 miles across the country. So if you guys wanna see that, make sure you like and subscribe to Summit Racing's channel, then head over to Robby Layton Nation and check out the complete build series of videos on this 57 Chevy, where we are utilizing the Summit Racing Equipment Studio, and every single piece and part is going to be coming out of the warehouse at Summit Racing headquarters in Talmadge, Ohio.
Now, if you guys have any tips that we missed or any suggestions, leave them in the comments below, and we'll see you guys later.